The following video contains spoilers.
Surely most of Final Fantasy XIV's players thought the first time they made a character and started the game that it was only natural that a creepy, black-robed Saturday morning cartoon villain would immediately appear before us. It was painfully obvious that such a villain standing in our way to heroism would sport a strange, cryptic glyph to add the extra oomph into the malefic flare of his masked face. And through our character's eyes, we were plunged into the realm of Eorzea. Clearly, we would be seeing a lot about these malevolent mages with cool holograms over their handsomely masked mugs. Clearly, there's nothing to see here. It wasn't until we meet more Ascians than just La Habrea, however, that we realized that each one of these enigmatic heavy metal sorcerers sported very different patterns. And then, much later on, we learned that these guys were, in truth, very sad and tired sages from when the world was one and whole. And then that these brands they flash like a fancy neon light are not, in fact, any sort of malefic rune that came from their status as Ascians. Rather, these sigils may well be older than the last convocation of 14 that watched over the world. Initially, the Ascians weren't developed to the extent they were from Shadowbringers on. However, we can trace the context for the Ascians and, by extension, the later concept of the Convocation to very obscure lore from the Ivalice games related to the Espers of Final Fantasy XII. The names of the seats of the Convocation originate from the Scions of Light. The bestiary entries for the Espers, or the Scions of Darkness, describe each as having been created in opposition to a Scion of Light. These Scions of Light bear the names of the seats of the Convocation, and by extension, the Ascians. The only exceptions to this are the seats of Ultima, Elidibus, and Azim. Ultima and Elidibus coming instead from Final Fantasy Tactics and tied to Ultima and Zodiark, and Azim being original to Final Fantasy XIV. In Final Fantasy XII, each Esper is shown to be encased into a crystal containing a glyph reminiscent of their appearance upon defeat. Sharp Eyes, or Ivalice lore nerds, back in early expansions did notice that the red glyphs that each Ascian overlord manifested was, in fact, a portion of the larger glyph of their namesake's counterpart. Over time, the portion taken of the Esper's glyphs has been growing more complex and diverse, from La Habrea, Nabriales, and Igiorm sporting a small part of its composition, to larger parts like Elidibus, Metron, and emet-selch, to complex rearrangements of different bits such as Logryph, to the white reverse-liked Fandaniel. The lesser black-masked Ascians have no glyph related to the Espers, instead sporting an approximation of Zodiark's silhouette from his Final Fantasy XII incarnation. In addition to this, we know that the entire glyphs were not unknown to the ancients, for we can see the full versions adorning the entrances of the words of Metron, Halmarut, and La Habrea at the Academia in Nider, so it's safe to assume that the same applied to the different wings related to each seat. As for the possible implications, we will get into that later. For a long time, the glyphs were considered little more than aesthetics, a way to identify the Ascian in question in the event they were inhabiting another body. However, even before certain off-screen revelations, one could spot at least 3 instances in which the glyphs tend to manifest: as a manner of formal introduction, when using their magics or gathering ether, and when the individual in question is under emotional pressure or distress. While the sigils are never explained or addressed in-game or written materials, we did get something of an answer in an Elpis-related Q&A with Yoshida, during which we got a bit more insight into the purpose of the glyphs and the circumstances for their manifestation. They're supposed to act as some sort of power limiters, though the exact details about the workings weren't given to us. At the very least, this does explain why the glyphs manifest when their bearer is about to unleash their magics and when they experience powerful emotions, namely rage. As for why they need a limiter, one possible simple answer would be that the members of the Convocation, being the 14 sages most capable and powerful of an already etherically dense people, required this preventative measure as to not cause extreme damage if subjected to distress. Alternatively, one might say that the limiter glows when being disabled, allowing the bearer to unleash all of their power. Alternatively, it could be that it prevented an ancient from expending all their ether at once, not only preventing extreme acts of creation or destruction, but the death of the wielder. There have been only 3 known events of this level of creation: the birth of Zodiark, the restoration of the world after the first final days, and the summoning of Hydaelyn. There is another instance in which the glyphs seem to manifest, and it seems to be closely related to memory and soul. Up until Shadowbringers, the Ascians had been shown to be largely in control of their glyphs' manifestation. That is, until Gaia awakens to her memories as Logryph by Metron's prodding in the final part of the Eden storyline. This disproved the possibility of the glyphs being something granted by the Ascians upon, but something that originates from the soul itself after ascension. With Logryph having died and then reincarnated, she was ascended instead by Metron's memories of her without a convocation crystal. This implies that the glyphs of the convocation awaken alongside their memories of the person they once were, and that they're a fundamental part of their soul that endures the cleansing of the ethereal sea, akin to a brand reflecting their very essence. It's unclear if the brand manifests only in the larger part of the souls of the Sundered, that is, the source, or if it's present in every fragment of the soul in every shard, since in Gaia's case, all we know is that she died on the first, but we don't know if Logryph's previous incarnation came from the source or from the shard, nor how dense her soul actually is. The connection between glyph and soul is also underlined in Pandemonium's storyline, namely through La Habrea's act of self-sundering in order to purge himself from Athena's corruption. The visual of him tearing his glyph in half illustrates his incomplete soul, torn apart with his own hand. With the recent events of Dawntrail in mind and the etheric surgery that preservation applied to the Alexandrians that separated memory from soul, another question arises to the mystery of the glyphs. The research logs found in Origenics mention that the memory removal process has to scrub clean even the slightest trace of memory from the soul in order to leave it completely clean for rewriting. Hypothetically speaking, it's not a stretch to consider the question, are Ascian glyphs a part of a soul that said separation would not be able to remove if they're capable of enduring the cleansing of the ethereal sea? In Shadowbringers, one could have possibly started to see the threads of connection once we learned of the Convocation of 14's role as stewards and servants of the planet and humanity. However, it was not until Endwalker that we got further details on what their seats entailed. It happens that each seat is tied to one field of knowledge and expertise, and as emet-selch explains, the duty and name of the seat becomes the holder's life and purpose until the day they choose a successor. This, paired with Hydaelyn referring to the Ascian glyphs back in A Realm Reborn as the Crimson Brand, brings up a very interesting concept that with Dawntrail stepping into the lore of the Fabula Nova Chrysalis series has now gained much more relevance, the brand of a l'Cie. For a bit of context of what a l'Cie is in the Fabula Nova Chrysalis, or Final Fantasy XIII series, they were narratively conceived to serve as a dark turn on the concept of the classical warriors of light. They are chosen individuals granted powers by a crystal, but by being chosen are cursed to carry out a fate imposed onto them by higher powers. As such, l'Cie are chosen by crystalline godlike beings to carry out a specific task or focus, a purpose to which their very souls are tied. This process turns them into something else than merely human. Depending on the entry, l'Cie have a limited window of time to carry out said fate. In the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, this window can be days, weeks, or even months. In Final Fantasy Type 0, they are granted eternal life in service to the crystal and gradually lose their humanity until their service is done. This is extremely reminiscent of the fate of the Ascians in Final Fantasy XIV, as the Unsundered constantly call back to their duty. Even the Sundered Ascians are condemned to follow the path of their former Unsundered selves, conceivably forsaking the lives they chose for the ones they led before, unable to create for themselves a new path even after death and rebirth. The brands of the l'Cie manifest as a tattoo in Final Fantasy XIII, but the implication is that their very souls are scarred with the brand, and it wouldn't change a thing if they tried to surgically remove the brand. In Type 0, l'Cie manifest their brands when using their power in a fashion quite reminiscent of Ascian glyphs. And because of the deep Type 0 references that were introduced in Dawntrail, it's possible that they'll go for Type 0's type of l'Cie if they're indeed referencing the brands. We also see brands in Final Fantasy XVI tattooed in the skin of bearers, that is, those born with the gift of magic, and thus considered subhuman and treated as slaves in the realm of Valisthea. This is why they are also referred to as the branded, though the brand is more superficial than one that marks the very soul itself. These tattoos do, however, implant beneath the skin a small poison sac, meaning that if a bearer tries to extirpate the brand, the poison sac will break and the bearer will die. Only exceptionally talented healers may attempt the removal, and it's not exempt of risks. The plot of Final Fantasy XVI is actually heavily modeled after Final Fantasy XIII, so it's not a coincidence that the bearers share so many similarities with l'Cie, and also raises the question about Ascian brands and how fatal could it be should anyone try to forcefully remove it from their soul, or if it is even possible to. This is admittedly a form of speculation, but there's still an undeniable resemblance between the Convocation's brands and the concept of the l'Cie. For now, it might not mean much. However, it's entirely possible that this connection may be explored come next expansion onwards, so it's prudent to not dismiss this observation outright, especially after Dawntrail formally stepped into FNC territory. There are, after all, 2, perhaps even 5, Ascians remaining. To conclude this breakdown, let's do an exercise of speculation proper. We know these glyphs are taken from Evolution lore, and the Convocation seats' names are those of the Scions of Light that oppose the Scions of Darkness that joined Ultima in her revolution against the gods. Naturally, there is already an established alignment between the Ascians and an entity named Zodiark. In Evolution lore, the direct opposite of Ultima, who never took part in her schemes against mankind, going so far as to isolate himself. From the Pandemonium questline, we learned that La Habrea was able to sense Athena's corruption, which works identically to tempering, and that he needed his complete brand and power in order to purge it from Hegemon's soul. We also know that the heart of Sabik is Oricite, and that Athena was being corrupted by Ultima herself, as Pandemonium 12 Savage made no effort in hiding by blasting an orchestral version of Ultima's perfection and having Pallas Athena directly quote the High Seraph in the Ivalice raids. As such, we might infer that La Habrea was able to sense Ultima's corruption, and that with his full power and his brand restored, he was able to cleanse it. The following step requires a bit of meta-narrative reading, and it has to do with the Viper job's nature and questline. Jobs introduced in an expansion tend to become lore relevant in the following one, and this time both Viper and Pictomancer had undeniable ancient/Ascian connections. In the case of Vipers, the job's name comes from a species of serpent, and Zodiark in Evolution lore is associated with the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, himself being a feathered snake in his mature form. Vipers are hunters trained to seek out and put down the threat of the massively powerful Tural Vidral, beasts not unlike the auspices of the Far East that awaken to great power if they live beyond a threshold of years, and serve as guardians and protectors of Tural. And they are taught, too, to invoke the power of their predecessors through their reawakened skill and use it against their sworn prey. Now, this surely sounds like it doesn't have anything to do with the Ascians, but the Viper job may indeed be teasing the Ascian connection through their association with snakes and some other details that have to do with the questline. If so, then we should ponder if, just like the Vipers, the Convocation brands are indeed related to Ultima and the Lucavi, allowing their bearers to sense her presence and corruption in the world and drive them to cleanse it. Especially if Ultima spreads her influence through cognition hazards, as it was the case in the Pandemonium questline, it is possible that this hypothetical ultimate purpose has been forgotten by the Convocation itself, or perhaps ignorance is their shield against a foe who uses knowledge to take over one's mind. The question remains, was the Convocation meant to be hunters of Ultima? And if this was the case, now that we have effectively eliminated those who bore the brands and possessed an unsundered soul, have we left ourselves at the mercy of Ultima's corruption, without the means of cleansing her influence?